Hello everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar organized by Advisera. Today's webinar will give you an insight on how to define an appropriate scope for your ISO 27001 implementation and which elements you need to take into account when setting the ISMS scope. The webinar is intended for people who are just starting their ISO 27001 project. Today's webinar will be presented by Dejan Kosutic, an experienced ISO 27001 consultant and an author of numerous books, courses, and articles on information security. The presentation will last approximately 40 minutes, after which the presenter will do the 20-minute question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, you don't have to wait for the Q&A session. You can ask any question during the presentation by typing it in the question pane in your Zoom control panel. Of course, during the Q&A session, the presenter will answer any of your remaining questions. By the way, you should close all internet applications to avoid the problems with the sound during the webinar. You can also download the slide deck for this webinar's presentation from Zoom's chat panel now. And finally, to make sure the sound is working, if you hear the audio, could you please raise your hand using the hand-raising tool in your control panel? Thank you.
Thank you for this introduction, and thanks to all of you who have logged into this webinar today. I see lots of your hands, so I hope that the sound is working fine. And, very often I see companies that are stuck at this point where they have to define the scope, and they spend like weeks or months. And this is really not necessary, because I would say the decision around the scope should be rather straightforward, especially if you know how to do it. And so in this webinar today, I'll speak exactly about this, how to set the scope for your ISMS for your company. And this webinar is intended for people that are beginners in this area. So I'll focus on setting the ISMS scope, and I'm not going to speak about other things about, let's say, steps in the implementation or risk management or implementation of the controls. So for these other topics, please do take a look at our other webinars, which are focused on these other specific areas. So if you're just planning to start your implementation, this is probably the biggest dilemma that you face in the beginning, and you have to do it right, because once you define the scope, it will determine lots of things afterwards. So you don't want to do it in a wrong way. So one big thing, or well, let's say the most important purpose of defining the scope is that defining the scope basically means that you want to define which information in your company you are going to protect. I would say this is, let's say, the most simplistic explanation of what the scope means. So defining the scope is about which information you want to protect, but defining the scope is not about which controls or safeguards you're going to use. This is something that is determined later on. Actually, I have one slide showing, what are the steps and when you actually define the scope in your implementation, and on the other hand, when do you define the controls, which happens much later on during the implementation. Good. So I'll discuss all these things during the webinar. How to set the scope. What is the distinction between setting the scope and defining which controls to implement. Anyway, this is the agenda for today. So first I'll go. First I'll basically tell you where to define the scope, how to document it, what is the process. There are especially many questions around, if you have anything in the cloud, that you're using cloud services, how to scope these things. How you actually handle security within the scope versus security of third parties, and finally the biggest challenges. So before I move on, my colleague will show you a poll, and the poll question is, which of these topics would you like this webinar to focus on? So if you can answer this poll, and then just to get me a better feeling on what you're interested in the most, so that I can actually spend more time on these topics during the webinar. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to answer this, and then we'll continue. Okay, I think most of you have answered the poll, so let's see the results. Okay, so it seems that the process of defining the scope and the scope if servers are in the cloud. So, okay, these are obviously the top questions. And yes, I'll definitely spend most of the time at these things. I'll go through other topics as well, but this is where I'll spend most of the time today. Good. So, first of all, where is the scope defined? Actually, it's defined in two separate places. First of all, you need to have this ISMS scope document, which describes, the scope in more details, and this is internal document. And the second place where you define the scope is in the certificate, the ISO 27000 certificate. If your company goes for certification, you'll get this certificate from the certification body. And there, in, let's say, half a sentence or one sentence, you describe what is your scope. So these are the two places where you define the scope. Now, the first one, the ISMS scope document, this is usually a one-page document, maybe two pages document where you actually describe this. Whereas, again, this certificate, it's maybe a half a sentence or sentence, so it's much shorter. This is a kind of a summary of your scope. So you have to keep this in mind when defining your scope. Of course, you first start with your ISMS scope document, and then when you go for the certification auditor then summarizes, I would say, the scope for the certificate. Now, what are the best practices on documenting the scope? What is acceptable is to define the scope in terms of, let's say, processes or departments. Typically, you would go for departments, it's easier. You might also take processes as let's say, the basis of your scope definition, but I don't find this very practical. Usually, it's easier by department. You can also define it by locations. You can also define some exclusions. So let's say that, okay, you want your, I don't know, IT department or let's say software development department to be included in the scope. Or you might define that only one location. If you have several locations in the company, then you want only one location to be included. So it's also possible to define scope in this kind of a way. It's also possible to define exclusions from the scope. And this could be, let's say, for, I don't know, some temporary workers. You want to exclude them from the scope. You can also exclude, I don't know, private devices that are used for work. You can exclude, for example, let's say home offices if your employees are working remotely. So these are the kind of things that you can exclude. Now, you cannot exclude, let's say, a part of the clauses that you have to comply with. So you probably know that ISO 27001 has these clauses from 4 to 10. There is no way to exclude any of these clauses, so all of these clauses must be included. There is no exclusion on that part. Now, when it comes to controls, some of the controls can be excluded, but this is not specified in the scope document. And so this is very often the question I received. So you cannot exclude any of the controls in the scope document. This is done later on. And I have one slide which explains, when this definition of controls is done. Definitely not in the scope document. Now, what is not acceptable in terms of scope definition, you cannot define the scope around your products. Okay, so you cannot say that, okay, you have, I don't know, this SaaS application and you want to build a scope around this application. No, it's not going to work. The certification body is not going to accept this. Why? Because ISO 27001 is a management standard, not a technical one. So you have to define your scope around, again, departments or processes and so on. So if you do have, let's say, a SaaS application and you want to kind of try to build the scope around it, then you have to define which departments in your company are in charge of this SaaS application. So you could say, okay, you have software development department, you have production department, you have customer support department, I don't know, sales department, and then define that these departments which basically handle this SaaS application are the ones that are included in the scope. Of course, this example was only for, let's say, a SaaS company. Of course, you could have a very different product in your company. Also, what is not acceptable is to define the scope in terms of technology. Of course, you can define which technology is included or excluded from the scope, but you cannot actually define the focus of your scope cannot be around one particular technology. So you cannot say that your scope is, I don't know, your virtual server. Okay, it's not going to work. Also, again, as I explained, you cannot define the scope in terms of security domains or controls from Annex A. Now, when the scope, so basically, when actually in the implementation process of ISO 27001, when actually is this scope defined? So there are a couple of steps before you actually define these requirements of interested parties. And by the way, I'll ask my colleague to send you now the link to an article which explains, this is the implementation guide for ISO 27001. And in this article, you will find all the implementation steps. So my colleague will send you now this link. So when you click this link, you will see this article. And it displays, amongst other things, these steps. Anyway, there are a couple of steps before requirements of interested parties, but these requirements of interested parties are important because sometimes interested parties are determining your ISMS scope. So just for example, let's say that you have, you're a software development company, you're developing software for a bank, and then the bank says that you have to be ISO 27000 certified and that you must include the software development department in your scope, okay? So before defining the scope, you actually have to collect the requirements of interested parties, right? And this is basically why this comes before. Okay, now, then you actually define the ISMS scope itself. I'll also show a couple of more, slides how this is done. But the question is now, when do you actually decide which controls you are going to implement or not? Now, this comes actually a couple of steps later. After defining the scope, you define this top-level information security policy, which defines the direction of your company, responsibilities, these kind of things. Then you actually go for defining risk assessment methodology and performing risk assessment and treatment. Why is this important? Because before you actually define which controls you want to apply and which controls are not really applicable to you, you have to define what are the risks in your company, okay? So you have to perform this risk assessment, and based on the assessed risks, you have to define which controls do you need. And then you go for the step, which is called statement of applicability. Now, in the statement of applicability, you define which controls you will apply and which controls are not applicable to your company. So my point being, you can exclude some controls, or of course include controls, but not in the definition of the ISMS scope. This, you can do it in the statement of applicability. This is a very different step from defining the ISMS scope. A very important thing to remember. Okay, now the next step, when you define the scope, I mean, don't complicate it too much. Again, I've seen companies doing it for weeks, for months. Why? Because they complicate too much. Don't complicate. I mean, why would you make your life harder than it needs to be? Anyway, what is usually not documented are these internal and external issues. Now, I mean, the standard does require you to take into account internal and external issues when defining the scope. However, the standard does not require you to write this down. Okay, so you simply have to take this into account. So, for example, you could, I don't know, one internal issue might be that your top management wants your whole company to be included in the scope. Okay, fine. This is the top management wish or top management decision. Obviously one internal issue that needs to be taken into account. External issue might be the one that I mentioned previously, and this is that there is a requirement of interested parties. So these kind of things, internal and external issues, obviously determining or influencing the scope. Now, another thing that needs to be taken into account but not documented are dependencies and interfaces. So again, you have to see if these dependencies interfaces are, let's say, feasible, if they fit actually your scope. But again, you don't have to write them down. I'll explain later on what these dependencies and interfaces mean. And list of assets. Some companies are listing these assets into the scope document. This is not very practical. Why? Anytime you change any of your assets, which by the way, happens more or less on if not daily basis, then weekly basis, then you would have to adapt, you update your scope document, on a weekly basis. Why would you do it? I mean, it doesn't make sense. Typically, assets are listed later on during risk assessment, during your asset inventory, but not during definition of the scope. My point here is, make your life easier, make your job easier. Don't make it complicated. Don't write these things down. I've seen companies, elaborating on internal and external issues on a couple of pages, making, all kinds of diagrams about dependencies and interfaces. I mean, come on, why would you do it? It's really not needed. Anyway, so what is the process of defining the scope? How you actually come to a decision if you really need, I mean, what kind of scope would be the most appropriate for your company? So first step is to start from the company size. So my suggestion here is, if your company is less than 50 employees, it's much easier, much quicker, that actually much cheaper actually to include your whole company in the scope. Okay. Why? Because if you want to, let's say that you have, I don't know, 3 departments within a company, you have, let's say, 45 employees. Okay. Now you want only one of these departments to be within the scope. This means that you actually have to treat these other 2 departments within your small company as external parties. Okay. This means that you have to sign some kind of agreements or protocols on, how they supply their services to your department, which is within the scope. And, this brings a lot of unnecessary bureaucracy on top of what you have to write the documents for 27001. And again, this is only slowing you down. So if you want to be quick, if you're a smaller company, if you want to be quick, include your whole company in the scope. It will be much easier, much quicker for you. Now, of course, if you're a company more than 50 employees, let's say a couple of thousand employees, then you should follow these other steps and really figure out what your scope should be. Okay, the next step is then to see the requirements of interested parties, because as I mentioned already, you might have some specific requirements of let's say your clients. Another example could be that you have some regulations which define which information you have to protect. So for example, GDPR, the European data protection law, it basically defines that you have to protect any personal data. So it makes sense actually to define the ISMS scope, at least for your whole for any of your departments which process personal data. Why? Because 27001 is the perfect solution for this Article 32 of the GDPR, and basically it's a perfect way to protect personal data from the GDPR perspective. So the point being here is, if you are a larger company, you should take into account all these interested parties, and then based on their inputs also define the scope. Then the next step is really to consider where is your most sensitive information. Because if setting the scope is about defining which information you want to protect, then the logical, I would say, conclusion here is that you have to find departments in your company where you have most sensitive information. So, for example, let's say that you are a pharmaceutical company. Now, where is the most sensitive information in a pharma company? It's basically in the R&D department, research and development department. Why? Because they're spending like, I don't know, billions of dollars on finding new, chemicals, I mean, new drugs, these kind of things. So basically, this is somewhere, where their most sensitive, most valuable intellectual property is. Okay, so if I were, I don't know, a pharmaceutical company, I would then define the scope, at least for my R&D department. And then the next step is really to find out what are the dependencies. Now, what are these dependencies? Means what does your department that will be in the scope depend on? So let's take this example of R&D department in a pharmaceutical company. What does it depend on? Okay, it depends probably on also the IT department. Okay, it might depend also on, I don't know, human resources department, these kind of things. So you have to understand what does this department within the scope depend on from the outside. These are the dependencies. And then the final step is to define, are these interfaces clear enough? Okay, so let's say that R&D department is dependent on, let's say, human resources department, but there are clear interfaces between them. So that they're using, let's say, a different I don't know, internal network, that they're using separate IT systems, that they're located in the different offices or locations, these kind of things. So in this case, there is a clear interface between them, so you can actually have, let's say, R&D department within the scope without this human resources department. Now, let me give you another example of, let's say, another type of a company. Let's say that within one let's say that you have two departments in a company. Let's say one handles production server, the other handles I don't know, software development. However, they're all working in the same room. Very often people from one department are working also jobs for the other department. They're all on the same local network. They're using all the same IT resources. In these cases, the interfaces are not clear enough. And the question is, in such a case, whether you can separate really this production department from the software development department. Okay, anyway, so these are the 5 steps that you should use to define your scope. Again, if your company is a small one, only 50 employees, then you basically don't have to go through these other steps. If your company is larger, then you have to go through these steps to actually find out what would be your particular scope. Okay, now let me actually show you how to document the ISMS using this Conformio software. So Conformio is a software that we developed, and it is used for smaller companies to implement ISO 27001. So for those of you who already are using Conformio, you know that you have this wizard with implementation steps. So basically it takes you through all the steps that you need to comply with the standard. Now, of course, one of these steps here is to define the ISMS scope document. Okay, as you can see, it comes here. It comes after you define the interested parties. And after that, you have information security policy, information security awareness, risk assessment, risk register, statement of applicability. Anyway, when you click any of these steps, what happens is that you actually open this particular step. In this case, this is the ISMS scope document. And there you have actually a wizard which takes you through all the elements of a document. So for example, so this is the ISMS scope document, and change history you have here, and it actually suggests you on how to fill it out. Okay, and you simply click next, and you will see that it suggests for processes and services, it suggests potential options on what is included, what is not included. You can, of course, I don't know, delete any of these from here, and so on. And you move next, organization units. Again, you can insert whatever you want, and it's automatically written in the space here. And you can also define which locations, so address, this and that. So it's very easy actually to fill this out document, document, and of course there are all other documents that are required for 27001 in Conformio as well, and you have the ability to, I mean, you can use them through Conformio. Okay, good. So this is, let's say, one way to approach this implementation of the scope. Of course, you can use this. I mean, you can define the scope using some other tools or some other documents as well. Good. Now let me go further. There is very often a question of, if you have servers in the cloud, like if you're using cloud services or you're having some kind of a virtual server in the cloud, the question is, if this is something that, I mean, how do you define the scope around something that is completely virtual? Now, this basically comes down to the question of what you can actually control, because the things that you can control, you can include them in the scope, whereas the things that you do not control, you cannot include them in the scope. So, for example, this first row in this table. So you have your own physical servers on a third-party infrastructure, okay? So in this case, you actually control the physical servers, you control the software that you have on these servers, you control the data, of course, on these servers. In this case, you are actually including in the scope hardware and software and data, exactly the things that you do control. What you do not control in this case are, let's say, telecom links or, I don't know, air conditioning, physical security, these kind of things. This is something that is on the a data center provider. So these are the things that you are not including in the scope, okay? Okay, the second row, virtual servers in a third-party computing infrastructure, okay? In this case, let's say this could be, I don't know, Amazon AWS or Microsoft Azure or something like this. In this case, you're controlling only the virtual server. So this means that you're not controlling the hardware. The hardware is obviously provided by, I don't know, Amazon or Microsoft. You're controlling only the software and the data. So in this case, you're including in your scope only software and data. If you're using a third-party platform, then you can include only data and application software. If you're using, I don't know, third-party software as a service, then you can include only data. So software as a service could be, I don't know, like Gmail, okay, or this Zoom that we are now using for this webinar. You don't control any kind of software there. You don't control, obviously, any hardware. You can control only the data actually that goes through this software. So this is, I mean, very simple way to define, I mean, whatever you control, you can include in the scope, and this is basically it. Right, now let's move on. Yeah, so very often there is a question on, okay, how do you actually control, how do you protect information if this is out of your control, if this is controlled by third parties? Okay, so it's I would say, very often a logical question. So let's say hypothetically that you have this kind of setting. You have the one department, Department X, which is part of your scope. It's inside of your scope. And then you have some 3 departments which are outside of your scope. So you define that you want only one department to be part of your scope and 3 departments outside of your scope. And then you have some suppliers, so suppliers A, B, and C. Now, when you want to implement security in your department within the scope, then you're basically applying these controls from the Annex A. Okay, so I've written down only the sections from Annex A. So this is A5 organizational controls, A6 people controls, physical controls, technological controls. You probably know this already. So there are in total 93 controls, and you can, of course, define which of these are applicable. And then you apply them to your particular systems, to your particular, I don't know, people, processes, and so on. Example, I don't know, you are applying the backup for the data on your server XYZ. Okay, as simple as that. Now the question is, if this information that you're protecting within the scope is used by, I don't know, these suppliers, or by these departments outside of the scope, then how do you actually control or how do you influence the security if this data is actually out of your, so to say, perimeter, outside of what the scope is? And basically, this is defined in the following way. If you have, let's start with the right-hand side first. If you have suppliers, then you protect the information that these suppliers, I mean, the data actually that is within your scope, when it is processed by suppliers, then you actually protect this information or data by signing agreements and defining security clauses within these agreements with these suppliers. Okay. So, for example, let's say that you have, I don't know, an accountant, and you're using this accounting service to, manage your books. Okay. Within your agreement with this accounting firm, you have to define the security clauses on how you expect this firm to protect your data, because they have obviously the access to your confidential, let's say, financial information. Okay. If you have, I don't know, a supplier, let's say, okay, cleaning service, okay. So you have cleaning people, walking around your offices and cleaning them, and potentially access, any I don't know, devices or servers if you have them in physical way and so on. Again, in the agreement with this cleaning company, you would define security clauses on what kind of security you expect from this service to be provided. Or if you have a cloud provider, then you basically either sign agreement with security clauses with this cloud provider on what kind of security you expect from them, or you basically rely on their terms and conditions. Of course, if you're using, let's say, Gmail, it's not like Google will want to sign a specific agreement with you, or Microsoft for that matter. So what you have to rely on is basically their terms and conditions, where they present which kind of security they use for their cloud systems. So this is how you handle the security of your data from the scope when processed by external parties. But again, from ISO 27000 perspective, these departments 1, 2, and 3 are also outside of the scope. So how do you handle security? I mean, security of data when these departments are in question? In these cases, it would not make sense to sign agreements with them, but you can actually have company-wide policies and procedures which specify how security is handled. So these company-wide policies and procedures do not cover only your department X, which is within the scope. It also covers actually all the other departments, and they specify, and these kind of policies and procedures also specify security with within these other departments. Or you can have some kind of, let's say, more informal protocols, security protocols on which kind of security is expected from these other departments. So I wanted to show you this diagram just to show you, even though that you have define the scope only for one department, this data which is processed within this department will be most likely processed also outside of this department. And then this is the way to deal with these third parties. Okay, very well. I have a question from Bernardo. Bernardo is asking, if possible, to have two different ISO certificates for a company with two scopes. The idea is to have a separate certificate for a division department that is only in charge of a specialized service, and then in future merge one into one certificate, or shall we just include that department during our recertification audit coming this year? This new department is actually a new acquisition from another company earlier this year. So, I mean, first is that if you actually had two companies which are merging, and let's say both of these companies had a certificate, first you have to judge whether you need, let's say, the certificates for both parts of this new merged company. This is something that you have to decide. It's more like a business decision. If you decide that you need, let's say, only, I don't know, one part of one certificate, not two, or let's say one part of your company, not the other one, then you basically leave only one part, not the others. If you want to have both, then you have to align the ISMS and actually expand the ISMS so that it covers both of these, let's say, scopes that were previously in a separate company, and make sure that you align all the policies, procedures, technologies, processes, and so on. Okay, Penny is asking, do you have any examples of scopes that have been written that can be used to help you write our own scope? Yes, I mean, Conformio is one of the, let's say, ways to do this. So I'll ask my colleague actually to send you the link to Conformio, where you can sign up for a free trial. And yeah, you can use Conformio to write this kind of scope document, and you can use the template from Conformio. Good. Now let's move on. So what are the biggest challenges? And by the way, I received lots of your inputs on what you find as biggest challenges, and I tried to summarize the 5 most common questions here in this slide. So one of the challenges was a definition of scope for SaaS solutions. Then challenge was to agree within the company what are the most critical parts to be included in the scope. One challenge was inadequate management's competencies and indecisiveness. Challenge was the approach. If we should define the scope by departments or by assets or by services. And finally, if the whole organization should be in the scope or only some entities, meaning some departments or let's say some maybe subsidiaries or these kind of things. So I'll actually give you some inputs, some ideas on how to approach each of these challenges. But first, I'll ask my colleague to present you a poll. And the poll question is, which of these challenges do you think are the most appropriate for your company? And after you answer this poll, then I'll give you this feedback on how to address these challenges. Okay, I think most of you have answered the poll, so let's see the results. Okay, it seems that the second one, agreeing within the company what are the most critical parts to be included in the scope, this seems to be the biggest one. The second biggest challenge, the approach, should be defined by departments or by assets or something else. And the third one, a definition of scope for SaaS solutions. Okay, this first one is interesting. Anyway, so thank you for these inputs. Let me go one by one. Okay, definition of scope for SaaS solutions. Okay, I had the slide around it. So again, the principle is what you can control, you can include it in a scope. What you cannot control, it's simply out of your scope. And basically, this is it. Now, the second, actually the biggest challenge for most of you, agreeing within the company what are the most critical parts to be included in a scope. Now, if you actually start by using this process where what that I've shown you, it's basically you start with the size of your company and then interested parties, and then you go and define I mean, all of the other things. So basically, if you follow these steps, one of the steps there is, again, I think the third step is really what is the most critical, where is the most critical information based in your company, in which department? So when you follow this kind of a logic, it becomes much more easy. You can define this scope much more easily, because you suddenly realize that okay, we have to focus on where we process the most sensitive data, and basically this is then the answer to the question on what the scope should be. Okay, now the challenge of inadequate management competencies and indecisiveness. Now, to be honest, the management doesn't have to be competent in I don't know, security or let's say ISO 27001. It's not really their job, okay? If you are a security manager or if you're a project manager, it's your job actually to present them the whole case in such a way that it's easy for them to understand. And again, simply phrasing the question, okay, if you are the CEO, what do you think, where is the most critical information in this company? The CEO will answer you very, very easily this kind of a question because he or she knows very clearly in this company where is the most critical information. So you have to present the whole thing around the scope in a very easy to understand thing so that the top management, which knows nothing about security or very little about security, can make these kind of decisions. Okay, the approach should be defined by departments or assets on services. So definitely not services. As I mentioned, this is not allowed. Assets also a very bad idea. So you can the best way is definitely by departments, potentially by processes, but again, by process, it's going to take you a longer time to define this kind of a scope. So departments is the best way to do it. Of course, if you're a smaller company, you don't need to define departments. If you're a small company, your whole company goes into the scope. If the whole company should be in scope or some entities, again, this is a smaller company, typically the whole one. If you have, let's say, I don't know, a larger company with lots of subsidiaries, then it's of course easier to start only one. Typically, if you have, I don't know, headquarters and I don't know, 20 branch offices, then you can go with the headquarters, and then later in some later iterations you can include also some branch offices in the scope. But typically, you start only with one. This could be a head office, or I don't know, this could be an IT department, or as I mentioned, this could be, I don't know, research and development department in let's say, more research-oriented companies and so on. Good. Now, so, to conclude, as you can see, if you define the scope correctly at the very beginning of your project, you will not go, let's say, too wide with your security or too narrow with your ISO 27001. And of course, that will save you quite a lot of time. And for that purpose, you can use Advisera as conform software. And again, you can use this link that my colleague has sent you, and you can sign up for a free trial and see how this ISMS scope wizard works. And my colleague will also send you now the schedule, the link actually to schedule a call with our Conformio expert, and he'll show you, if you want, he'll show you how the software works and especially how this template for the ISMS scope works. Okay, very well. So let me go to the Q&A session. And before I actually begin with this question and answer session, just to mention that you can also ask me anything about ISO 27000 directly. Just send me an email and I'll answer as quick as I can. And if you have to leave before this Q&A session is over, please do fill out a short survey that will open right after you leave the webinar. Okay, first I'll go actually through the questions I received before the webinar, and then I'll show you the answers, and then I'll go through the questions that I received during the webinar. So Stephen was asking, as a certification body, should there be a clear checklist for the clients in advance so that auditees know that if they have done these, they will be able to pass the audit and get the certificate? Okay. Okay, this is not directly related to scope, but I mean, basically the checklist for the companies is the whole standard, right? So there is not like, I mean, there is there are clauses 4 to 10 from the standard that the companies need to comply with, and also the Annex A, right? You have 93 controls. So if a company wants to prepare to be compliant with the standards, the whole, again, the whole, I would say, standard is basically the checklist. Now, my colleague already has sent you this link to this article about these. This is the ISO 27000 implementation guide. In this article, you will see the steps for the implementation. You will see some tips on how to prepare these kind of things. I'll also show you another tool which you can use to prepare for the certification audit, and this is called Experta. Let me switch to another screen. So Experta is basically AI knowledge base for ISO standards. It's also developed by our company, and you can ask questions around what will the certification auditor look for regarding ISMS scope. Okay, let's see what it answers. Yeah, and then you have this very clear answer. It basically says. So during the audit, the auditor will ask you the following regarding clause 4.3, to show the mandatory document. If you want to take, if you took internal and external issues into the account, requirements of interested parties, all of these kind of things. And then you can click actually to tell you more. So you click tell me more, and then it actually gives you additional answer about what this ISMS scope document needs to have. And on the left-hand side, you actually see, the initial questions that you can click further about any of these. So let's say that I'm interested next in the, let's say, internal and external issues. I click tell me more. And then you have, additional information about it. Or you want to see about, I don't know, dependencies and interfaces, tell me more. And then it gives you quite a lot of information about dependencies interfaces. So basically, this is how it works. So you can really ask lots of questions here. Let me see. You can also ask questions around Annex A controls. So you can say, okay, list the Annex A controls. And it gives you the list of all the 93 controls. And then you're, let's say, interested in, let me see, remote working. I click tell me more. And it will explain you around remote working, everything you need to know. Now, you can also find some suggested questions. What evidence is needed for control 8.67 remote working? And I click this, and you will actually see what kind of evidence the certification auditor will look for, right? So if you want to prepare for certification, this kind of tool can help you, actually out. Now, for now, this is a free service, so I'll ask my colleague to send you the link, and you can register for Experta for free. Again, this is now still in beta, so we are not charging a fee for it, so you can use this as much as you can, as much as you want. Good. Now, going back, so Claudio, what are the 7 steps for a company that wants to start implementing ISO 27001? Again, you can simply open this article that my colleague has sent the link to. You can also ask Experta about the implementation steps. Simply type in, I don't know, ISO 27001 implementation steps. It will clearly give you the steps and everything else around these steps. Paul was asking, I think I've answered this question. So Laura was asking how to address heavily embedded third parties in scope. So if I understood well, this is the question around if you have some third parties which are, let's say, working very much for anything that is happening within the scope. So I can give you some examples on what this might mean. Let's say that you have a software development department in your company. Let's say that you have 7 people working there. Out of these 7, 5 are full-time employees, and let's say 2 are contractors, which are working full-time for you. Okay. So the question is, are these contractors, these 2 contractors that are actually sitting within your departments together with your employees, are they considered third parties, or are they considered a part of your scope? So basically, you can actually consider these 2 contractors as part of your scope, even though they're third parties, but you can consider them actually as part of your scope if they're working full-time for you, and if they are fully following all of your rules, meaning security rules or any other rules in your company. Okay, so in this case, you can actually consider them as part of your scope, even though they are not employed. Now, on the other hand, if you have, let's say, I don't know, a marketing team, you have a couple of people, and you have, let's say, search engine optimization expert who works only a couple of hours per day or per week for you. Now, in this case, since this SEO expert is only working occasionally for you, and is probably working according to some other rules, not according to your security rules, this kind of service then needs to be, or this kind of contractor needs to be outside of your scope, and it needs to be considered as a third party. Good. Stefan was asking difference between interfaces and dependencies. Is there a simple rule? So interfaces are basically what stands between, let's say, two departments. Okay. From the physical point of view, this could be, I don't know, a door, right? So you're having one department in one office, the other department in another, let's say, room. Okay, and between them there is a door. So this would be a physical interface. And dependencies is simply, how does one department depends on the other to perform its tasks? So what kind of, let's say, services or what kind of information is one department using from another? This is dependency. Leonard was asking how to assess and describe the interfaces for non-physical assets. Okay, for non-physical assets like, I don't know, IT network, I mean, the interface would be simply, let's say, some kind of a network device that stands between, let's say, two network segments, okay? So this could be some kind of, I don't know, switch or something. So basically that does not allow the traffic to flow freely from one part of the network to another. So this could be, let's say, on the, let's say, digital end, this could be an interface. Adrian was asking, how do you include or exclude organizations with international co-located subsidiaries and sister agencies under different corporate registration? Let me see if I understand this question. How do you include or exclude organizations with international co-located subsidiaries and sister agencies under different corporate registration? Okay. I mean, it's possible to actually include in one scope several companies that are, let's say, related by ownership. Okay, so you could have one ISMS scope that includes 3 sister companies. When can you do it? You can do it if these are, let's say, separate legal entities, but operating systems and everything within the company is basically merged. Okay, so they have separate legal entities, but I mean, they normally operate as one single company. They have one management team. They have, the processes which go across all of these 3 companies. So in these cases, you can actually have one ISMS scope with several companies within it. Now, if these companies are completely, separate, completely different, then it doesn't make sense really to merge them into one scope. It would be a mess. So it's easier actually in this case if these companies are not operationally related. It's better to separate them. Okay, Margaret was asking how to include ISO 27017 controls in the scope. So this is a cloud standard, ISO 27017. So again, you are not including controls into the scope. You are including controls in the statement of applicability, which comes later on in this process of the implementation. Basically, this is how you can include any controls from any other standard, not only ISO 27017. Okay, Anil was asking, what will this be the scope for occasional office, let's say office that is rented as and when required, and others can rent it when we are not using it. Such office will have conference meeting rooms, etc. So basically this could be a, let's say, co-working space, and you're using some kind of, I don't know, temporarily rented office for conferencing. In this case, you would typically exclude this kind of offices from the scope, because you're not controlling them fully. This co-working space company is controlling these offices, but not you. So typically you exclude these kind of things from the scope. Christina was asking, are auditors allowed to challenge or push back on the scope, definition and selection of controls if they disagree? Can they withhold the certification due to a disagreement on scope? So first of all, we have to distinguish between the scope definition and selection of controls. As I explained, these are very two different things. They don't have much in common. Auditor can actually challenge your selection of controls if this is not aligned with your risk assessment. But when it comes to scope, in practice, auditor will not challenge this. Why? Because you have to agree with the certification body on your scope actually before the certification audit starts. So you have to contact, the certification body. You have to ask them for a quote. You have to get there after the quote. You have to sign the agreement. All of these things. So through this whole process of quoting and signing the agreement with the certification body, you actually have to explain what exactly your scope is. What does this mean? This means that once the certification auditor comes to do the certification audit, already the scope is defined and basically signed between the certification auditor and the company, certification body and the company. So, I mean, in such a setting, it's not possible for auditor to challenge the scope itself. Michelle was asking, as an advisor, what advice can we provide to clients in supporting the implementation or to help in decision ISMS according to ISO? I assume your question is around defining the scope. So again, as a consultant, you can actually help your clients define the most optimal scope, which will, I would say, enable them to implement the standard to get certified with the, I would say, least effort. So this would typically be the role of the consultant. Christian was asking, is ISO 27001 suitable for SMEs or for small companies? I would say definitely yes. A large majority of our clients that are using Conformio and our other products are smaller companies. And I think the smallest company that actually got certified together, I mean, using our products is, I think they had 3 employees. So it is possible to have very, very small company and get implement the standard and get certified. Favas was asking, what are the minimum requirements we can start with for the certification audit? Basically, it's again, you have to implement the whole standard and you have to complete this internal audit, management review, all the corrective actions, and then you can actually go for the certification. Let's see actually what Experta answers. So what are the requirements to go for certification audits? Let's see what it answers. Yeah, basically it answers this. So to get your company certified, first you need to complete implementation steps, and then you have to go through internal audit, management review, corrective actions, and then you're ready for the certification. Yeah, so good. Let me go back here. Okay, these were the questions I received before the webinar. Now let me see the questions during the webinar. Michael is asking, if our company uses SharePoint and Microsoft Exchange SaaS, we have to list the data stored with SharePoint and MX Exchange in the scope document, just like we list the buildings. So again, you are not listing, or the standard allows you to list all of these assets within your ISMS scope document. So you're not doing anything wrong, but it's not practical. Again, I do not advise to list that you list all the assets within your scope document. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be impractical because you will have to update your ISMS scope document anytime you actually have a new assets. So don't list assets within your scope document. Usually list your assets later on in your inventory of assets. Okay, this is the place to list all of your assets. Okay, Arif is asking, do we need to change the scope when going from 27001 2013 to 2022? Absolutely not, because the changes within these standards, I mean, within these revisions of the standards, do not, specify anything around the scope. So the scope remains exactly the same. What you actually have to do is go through these 4 steps that are needed for making this transition. And I'll ask my colleague to send you a link to an article which speaks, this is basically an infographic which speaks about what are the differences between these 2 revisions of the standard. And also, my colleague will send you the link to a course about the transition. So in this transition course, you will learn, how what are the steps that you need to take as part of this transition. Okay, Georgie is asking, I still have problems understanding the approach of scope definition in case we have the most sensitive data in the cloud, the servers of which we can't control, but that doesn't belong to processes or departments. So if you have, I don't know, your, I don't know, department, let me see. Okay, let's say that the most sensitive information you have is in your, let's say, software development department, okay? If the software development department is the one that actually uses cloud systems for storing this information, then basically you have to include your software development department in the scope. So you focus on the software development department. Of course, this software development department is using various cloud services for storing this data. So then you focus on software development department, and as simple as this. Okay, Mary is asking, what if any additional security controls should be implemented with HRIS? I'm not sure if I understand your question correctly. This is not related to scope. So you define the security controls to implement in the standard later on in the statement of applicability. This is not part of the scope definition. And yes, you simply define additional controls in the statement of applicability. You don't have to stick only to Annex A controls. Carlos is asking, is it worth to do a gap analysis in a company which has not implemented 27001 or companies which are beginning to implement security policies and controls? Gap analysis might be good for larger companies just to assess kind of the effort needed, but for smaller companies, even for mid-sized companies, I don't think this is needed. So it's not. It's only an additional effort, whereas the outcomes, especially for smaller companies, is not very clear. I mean, smaller companies typically don't have any existing documentation, so the gap analysis is not really going to tell them anything they didn't know already. I mean, they know that they have nothing, so gap analysis is not going to give them any additional information. Nir is asking, does a company located in Germany have to do the audit at an examination institute in Germany, or alternatively, is a certificate obtained in another country also accepted in Germany? So according to basically this, in this ISO world, you have these certification bodies, okay? Certification bodies are organizations that have the license to issue certificates, and this is given by the accreditation bodies. Typically, the most popular accreditation body is this UCAS. This is the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. So, for example, you have these big certification bodies like, I don't know, SGS, DNV, Bureau Veritas. In Germany, you might have, I don't know, DQS, I don't know, TUV, these kind of things. Most of them actually have the accreditation from UCAS. So even though they operate in the German market, they have the, I would say, license from the United Kingdom Accreditation Service. And this is fine. So you don't need to have the accreditation from a German accreditation body to issue actually the certificates for a German market. Okay, by the way, there is also another, I do another webinar on certification. So if you want to learn more about this certification process and how this whole thing works, you can actually sign up for this other webinar. And I'll ask my colleague to send you the link for this other webinar. Okay, Christina is asking, our auditor insists that SharePoint is software development and expects us to add all relevant software development controls to our scope. We have no control over SharePoint source code, and although we do set up test SharePoint sites when building new workflows, have a dedicated development and test environment for SharePoint. We are afraid that scoping in these development controls will result in non-conformities. How do you justify the differences? Okay, so basically the point here is that SharePoint and basically other off-the-shelf services, I mean, true, you're not developing them, you're simply using cloud services. So you have to, in this case, you would have this control about using third-party cloud services as applicable. But if you are not, I would say, developing anything, or if Microsoft is not developing something specific for you regarding SharePoint, which I believe they don't, then the software development here is not applicable. I mean, the control is not applicable. Now, of course, you might have some other software development activities which are not related to your, I mean, which you might have in your company. Okay, Carlos is asking, some companies delegate the project to implement an ISMS to the IT department, and the IT manager sets the scope only to IT processes, systems, and data, arguing that they manage all information assets for the whole company. Maybe they do it so that all scope and costs of the implementation is as low as possible. How do you handle this objection? Well, it's easy. I mean, the decision on what is the scope for a company needs to be not on one department. It needs to be a top management decision. I mean, the decision of your, let's say, CEO or someone who is at the top of your company. And then, again, this person needs to judge where do we have the most sensitive data. If this is only an IT department, fine, go for IT department. But if this is, let's say, IT department plus some other department, then you might consider actually having this having the ISMS for a couple of departments. Okay, Michael is asking, I'm sorry if I have to repose the question, but I just don't get it how I define the SAS we use. You say that we have to include what you can control. I understand that with the SAS, is the data. So what do I do about it in the scope? So for example, let's say that you are using Gmail, that you're using, I don't know, Zoom, these kind of things. So basically in the scope, you define that your, okay, you list, let's say 3 departments which are part of the scope. And you can also add that the part of the scope are all the data that you're using, that these departments are using with their cloud services. You're not listing all these cloud services, again, because listing all these assets would not make sense, but you're simply adding that the data in the cloud used by those departments are part of the scope. Okay, Alex is asking, my company has a solution that stores PII. How do you determine the scope? Again, you have to define in terms of either departments or processes what you want, which departments or processes you want to cover with your ISMS scope. Again, if this is a small company, the whole company, if I don't know, if you have a company of 100 departments, you try to pick 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 departments which will be part of the scope. And again, you should try to see which of these departments are really processing these personal data, because obviously this would be a very good candidate to include in the scope. Good. I think I answered all the questions. So let me wrap up the webinar. So just a few words before I finish. So as I mentioned, this 1-hour webinar was too short to go into details of, I don't know, implementation steps or, you know, controls or certification process. And for that purpose, please do take a look at our other webinars, which go into more detail. And you can ask me anything about 27001 directly through email. You can also download this presentation deck from our website or take a look at Conformio and other things, and we'll send you the email with all the necessary links in a couple of hours. And again, after this webinar, you'll see a short survey, so I would kindly ask you to spend a minute to fill it in. And this would be all. Thank you very much for your participation, and I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. Have a nice day.